Dave Gabbard, welcome to our very first episode. This is kind of a new thing that we're journeying into where we just kind of want to explore different industries in business, find out how they're working in 2024, what things have been like over the last few years, and where we think those things are headed. We work for To Exceed, and we currently focus pretty hard on the trucking industry, specifically trucking recruiting. We're always looking for good qualified drivers. And we just kind of wanted to talk about the industry, where it's at and where it's going. So you've had quite a bit of experience in not only the trucking industry, but in logistics, in general logistics and trucking transportation as well. And you just kind of tell us about how much the trucking industry impacts the U.S. economy.
Sure, Matt. And one thing, just to understand a little bit of history and background, I've been involved in trucking. Actually, trucking was one of my first temporary jobs in between college classes back in, I'll go ahead and say it, back in 1981. I actually drove a flatbed for a local auction company. And that was my first endeavor into transportation. I wasn't looking to start a career then, but I did haul flatbed machinery for an auction company for a couple of years. And I always enjoyed it. And at that time, being, 1980, 81, trucking has always been important. Going back to the stagecoach days, you could even really look at the mail system and the Pony Express as a logistical type of company as well. It's delivering packages and envelopes, but still it's commercial transportation. As we look at the importance of transportation, I think I sum it up to everybody. The best way to sum it up is just take a look at where you're currently sitting. If you're in a kitchen or an office or your front room, and look around at everything that is physical in that room. Try to find something that at some point in its journey wasn't on a commercial vehicle going from point A to point B, whether it could be one of our ports that brings goods in from overseas, and then drayage drivers go in and pick it up and take it out. And then it goes to a logistics company for delivery to the end user. But when you think about everything that we have in our homes, in our businesses, where we work, where we play, everything came on a truck at some point, or I should say, and quantify that by saying commercial motor vehicle. That's exactly how important, and I think we all maybe got a little bit complacent with how important the trucking industry actually is until this little thing happened in 2000 and we had the pandemic, and we called it a supply chain crisis, but I'm not necessarily sure it was a supply chain crisis. It was the result of the pandemic decisions that were made. But all of a sudden, our usual expectation of being able to go to the grocery store or to Walmart or Dollar General and get whatever we need at any time of the day or night when they're open, all of a sudden we found out, well, why isn't this there? Where's my coffee that I like? Why do they have no flour in Walmart today? And then why can I go to Kroger and get it? We found out and started, if you'll recall back, how much everybody fell in love with trucking again. We had people at rest parks that were handing out food to the drivers because there weren't restaurants open for drivers to eat at. And, everybody really kind of got behind trucking. And I think it did a lot to mentally change the perception of truck drivers. Now, I think we've relaxed off of that a little bit. Maybe they're not as appreciated as much today, but people certainly learned the importance of trucking from mid-2000 to mid-2001. I think we could all agree that we all learned just how important transportation industry is, and more importantly, the drivers that make those deliveries happen. Does that wrap up and sum up how important transportation is in our everyday lives?
Yeah, it's sort of keeping America fed and supply of toilet paper. I remember that was a big issue that a lot of people had That was one of the first things to go.
Yep.
I have noticed that there seems to be an increase in like on social media. I'll see occasionally posts about go thank a trucker because you're able to eat or wipe your bottom or something like that. And it's go thank a trucker. And I know that it
Mhm.
used to be reserved for like the police or military, and so I've seen instances of that crop up on Facebook over the last few years. So yeah, I can definitely see where the appreciation has kind of come into play a little bit more post pandemic for sure.
Yes. And that was good. And that was good to see, because I think for a period of time, maybe drivers were taken for granted. If you'll remember back to we had a little boom at the 2018, beginning of 2019, we had a nice little trucking boom there that it was pretty short lived, but it was pretty nice. And then of course we rolled right into the pandemic in 2020, and then all of a sudden, not only did the public in general, I think, developed a much better perception of truck drivers and the importance of them and what they actually did, but it also made companies realize how important their drivers are and how difficult it really is to find that good driver, because we always talk about, for the last decade or so anyway, we've talked a lot about driver shortage from 2010, 11, 12 up to about 2022. That seemed to be on everybody's mind, the driver shortage. Oh, we don't have enough drivers. Well, I have another theory of that. We have plenty of drivers. We just have we do not a great job. All companies don't do a great job of hanging on to those drivers. There are some bright spots out there that have very good turnover because of their culture, their company, the way they treat their drivers. And I think that resonates with the drivers that feel appreciated, because one of the side effects of the pandemic or the supply chain crisis, whatever label you want to throw on what happened, one thing that was a windfall to the transportation companies was, because of the lack of capacity, because of all the shutdowns and the work restrictions, all of a sudden drivers became in very high demand because companies were willing to pay a premium price to have their freight hauled. And we started seeing contract prices in the industry start to skyrocket along with the spot market that occurred as the shippers were trying to shore up and lock up capacity because it was limited at that point. I say that because as we came out of the supply chain issues and were able to start keeping things on shelf at the normal levels and reduce out of stocks, one of the things that we saw, because of the inflation that started occurring in mid to late 2021 and into 2022, as we started seeing prices hike, we saw consumer demand on certain items and discretionary spending start to fall, which then meant there were less loads. We started seeing rates start to drop. And as rates started to drop, the capacity that the industry had gone out and paid dearly to add on in 2020 and 2021 was no longer necessary. So all of a sudden, people seemed to stop talking about the driver shortage. A lot of companies actually stopped advertising for drivers or cut back advertising quite a bit because their needs had reduced significantly compared to the prior 3 years. So I just think it's interesting. We saw this shift start about September of 2022. We started seeing advertising starting to cut back for drivers. We also noticed that all of a sudden people weren't talking about the driver shortage anymore, and not as often. It used to be pretty much the headlines, at least a few times a month in most of the daily online newsletters and those types of communications, where now we see an article every few months. Somebody may say something about the driver shortage. So again, we're starting to see some signs of the freight market starting to come back. We just saw released within the past couple of days the October numbers, and it looks like we had another increase, which makes 3 out of the last 4 months we've had an increase over the prior year. So while we're still struggling, we're starting to see some consistencies in gains and starting to see a little bit of an uptick in demand as well as rates. So hopefully, as the economy comes back, people adjust to the new pricing, wages catch up, etc., and we see more consumer product spending to create that need for more drivers. Hopefully what we'll see this time is that companies have learned that when you have $3.50 and $4 a mile freight during the pandemic, that's not the time to be hiring drivers. The time to be hiring drivers is not when every company out there is trying to pay drivers whatever they can to get that freight, but then as soon as it goes south, they reduce their fleet size. So hopefully we start balancing that fleet size with the current economy to stop and companies learn how to retain drivers better. Because again, I'll go back and say, I don't believe that we have as much as a driver shortage as we do a retention challenge, because the nature of the job, but also some of the culture in the industry is still not caught up with our younger markets, and we're not as favorably looked upon as a career choice while people are coming out of high school and looking at what am I going to do for the next 15 or 20 years of my life.
What is the biggest issue with retention? You just mentioned that the trucking industry isn't necessarily attracting young drivers as much as we would necessarily like. I guess I can kind of see that, but when they do attract some new drivers, what prevents them from hanging on to those drivers long term?
I believe that most drivers that leave companies, most feel that they're not valued. As we've done exit surveys over the year for clients, that's one of the consistent themes that we see when somebody leaves that's disgruntled. They're not upset because they had an issue. They're upset because of the way the issue was addressed or not addressed possibly, and they don't appreciate or understand the outcome. And many times, because hey, let's face it, it's trucking, and trucking happens, and it could be
What do you mean
anything.
by that?
I mean,
Happens.
there's things that are outside of the control of the company, and there's things that are outside of the control of the driver. It can be an accident on an interstate that shuts the interstate down for 3 hours, and you're 45 minutes from your delivery. You were going to be 2 hours early, and now all of a sudden you're going to be an hour and a half late.
Yeah.
You call your company, you talk to your coordinator, dispatcher, whatever that company has, and they're not necessarily, may not be empathetic to your issue, or they may be empathetic, but it's still a frustration point. And it's moments like that we're all adults here. It's the piss off factor. When a person's having a bad day already, and now they just found out that they're going to sit and it's going to take them 3 hours to drive 3 miles. And if they make 70 cents a mile, they're going to make $2.10 for the next 3 hours. And then they don't get an empathetic ear, or hey, I hate you're having this problem. I know it happens. Let me call the customer for you. They'll understand. There's not a thing we can do about it. We appreciate your patience. Hang in there. And maybe send the guy a $5 something on his fuel card so he can buy a cup of coffee and a hot dog on you. It's not that I have to pay you $50 for this. They just want to be appreciated and feel valued. And I think we can learn a lot as an industry. And that's for retaining the people that we already have. One of the challenges we've seen, we've always known, as I've been pretty heavily involved in transportation for the last 12 or 13, we've always had it 12 or 13 years. We've always skewed higher on the aid industry than other industries. There's several studies out there. Typically, most things you're going to read is the average age of truck drivers is somewhere between 54 and 58 years old. So that means we've got a lot of 70-year-olds driving, but it means we've got a bunch of 40-somethings. But the challenge is we don't have a lot of those 20-something and early 30-somethings. That is, I think, one of the biggest opportunities in transportation is to identify why we're not attractive to that demographic anymore. Why is the new entrance? Why is trucking not a choice when people come out of school, out of high school? Why are they not thinking trucking? We see a lot of generational people in trucking. Granddad was a trucker, dad was a trucker, and now, the son or the daughter is a trucker. So we see a lot of young people come in generationally. However, just the average person that's like, okay, I'm out of high school. What am I going to do now? Maybe they're going to go to college. Maybe they're not. Let's face it. How many of us that started doing something when we got out of high school, and if we're over the age of 40, how many of us are still working in that same career and have probably been in a couple or three different types of careers? And I think with young people, we've also has been impacted from a societal shift in the way we.
What do you mean by that?
Well, in the way we value our time, our leisure time, our off time, as we in trucking like to refer to it as our home time.
Yeah, no, that's interesting about the younger demographics, because that was coming to mind whenever you were talking about the retention issues, where I've known a few colleagues, particularly when I worked as an EMT, a lot of former truck drivers made their way into that, or like gradually went back to nursing school or something else that they were interested in long term. And that was like a good straight out of high school or whatever job for a shorter period. And I think in those cases, those guys that I knew, it was more the lifestyle. They liked the money of trucking, but it's like eventually you got to settle down. You don't want to, at least with the over the road stuff. It's
that kind of goes back to also what I was talking about, societal shift in younger families now, valuing that home time, valuing that off time, valuing that leisure time. And where we've had we've seen a change in the dynamic of the family structure, for example. When you think about trucking traditionally, and we have grown the amount of women that are drivers, there's been some great initiatives. The women in trucking, they just finished up their annual get together. And I mean, that has grown, exponentially over the last several years. And that's good to see. And it has raised it because, if you go back 10 years, we had like 1% of the drivers in the industry were female. Last I've checked, it's around 3.5%. Don't quote me on that. But the thing is, people recognize that that's an opportunity because women can drive trucks as good as men can drive trucks. Probably in a lot of cases, probably some are a little bit more careful, but there's certainly nothing in transportation from, hauling dry van and flatbed. We work with owner operator companies that have flatbed. These women own their truck. They go out there, they load backhoes, they chain them down. They are every bit as qualified. And so that was good that the industry recognized that. The challenge with that is how big is that opportunity? I mean, if we,
What do you mean
great.
by that?
What I mean is, okay, they recognized an opportunity. What is the ceiling? How many women are actually willing to go out and drive a truck? Now, it's been great that we maybe have doubled the number of women in trucking, but still, when you look at it as a total piece of the pie, but I still believe the biggest opportunity from a driver standpoint for transportation, we have to crack the code as an industry on how do we bring people in the beginning of their career and then keep them there for a period of time. And because we see a lot of young folks come into the industry, there's several trucking companies that offer driving schools where you can go to driving school for a couple, 3 weeks. You come out, you go over the road with a trainer for, 4 to 6 weeks, whatever the required number of hours is and how they structure it to get that. And, 8 weeks later, you can be in a truck yourself earning in today's market, $50,000 to $60,000 is your first year. Not a lot of jobs out there available like that for a person coming out without a degree or specific vocational type training. They haven't gone to a vocational school for a year or two. That's a pretty competitive salary. And then as you look at additional opportunities for growth and they get more experience, we, of course, in the business of helping companies market for drivers, we're pretty familiar with our pay, of course, with pay in the industry. And, a lot of these folks, their second year can pull up $70,000, $80,000. And so I think you said it earlier, Josh, that the money's great, but man, that lifestyle, and that goes back to the societal change where the young family now, they get home in the evening, they want to spend time with the kids as a family, not with dad or mom out in the cab of a sleeper somewhere at a truck stop, spending the night and video chatting with his kids 4 or 5 nights a week and then see him on the weekend. Today's desires for that work-life balance just doesn't necessarily support us being able to go out there and hire those types of people in mass from the younger generations. Now, we've seen the industry react, and I think it has certainly helped because the average age has gone down a little bit over the years, but it takes a long time to shift from a 56-year-old average to a 52 or 53-year-old average. But there is the place where they've recognized that younger people will entertain truck driving as a career as long as you can get them home a reasonable amount of time, meaning probably out no more than a couple nights a week. Ideally, any of our listeners on here that are in the recruiting side of this world know over the past 10 years, the first question, the question that gets asked more and more early on in the conversation is when the recruiter says, well, tell me what you're looking for. And the percentage that say, I'm looking for a local driving job has gone from probably, a low percentage to, depending on the number of calls we listen to, it can be as much as 50%. So it says that this is what they're telling us what they're looking for. I'll come to work for you and I'll be a good truck driver. I'm not going to spend 10 days in the cab of my truck at a truck stop and then go home and see my kids for 48 hours and be gone for another 10 days. And so we have to figure out how to bridge that gap. And we've seen some companies that have changed up their models to accommodate more local, or as we call them, home daily driving positions. We've seen the amount of many times dedicated lanes can have very frequent home time, if not home every day. We've seen more companies set up relay type networks that go from, for example, you would house a driver in, Memphis and Nashville and Knoxville or something. And then where the driver can't get to Knoxville and back in one day, he can get to Nashville and back, and the driver from Knoxville can get to Nashville and back. And so we're seeing more relay type freight on dedicated lanes that can work. There's different ways, but I think that's our biggest opportunity is we've got to continue to bring in young people. And there have been some initiatives started, the Women in Trucking, but also some initiatives started by some other folks to draw in younger people going to high schools, giving, exposing people to trucking at high schools, taking trucks there, getting kids excited about it. I mean, everybody on this call right now is a 16-year-old guy at one time, and man, those trucks were cool. And, you see a big truck, you climb up on it, and, those kind of things, we've got to snag them early. And that's, that's what I think, that's where I think the biggest opportunity now is, because our reliable drivers that'll go out there 2, 3, 4 weeks at a time, they're aging out of this industry. Those guys that are willing to go out and just live in their truck and not be home, it's becoming less and less. So we're going to have to figure out how to attract that younger demographic.
In attracting that younger demographic is part of the initiative to attract them, updating technology to streamline trucking and make it a little bit easier. But also, I guess what I'm asking is, what sort of pushback do we get a lot of pushback from the trucking company because because the demographic skews a little bit more toward like an older demographic, or has the trucking industry sort of been embracing changes in technology? Like, of course, I can't get anywhere without a GPS now. I mean,
Right.
how are truck driving companies utilizing that, and are they finding ways of utilizing that to attract younger drivers?
Yeah, and they have. There's been several changes from a technology standpoint.
Yeah.
You'll see companies now today, for example, with younger people, especially. When I say younger people, I'm talking about those 30, 35 and under. Social media, that internet connection to those people is an important thing. And because they stay connected with their communities, with their family, with their children through social media or text or whatever. So, we've seen companies that are putting in, mobile hotspots and Wi-Fi into the trucks so that, no matter where they're at, they've always got they've got a good Wi-Fi signal that's provided by the company. There was a push maybe 5 or 6, 7 years ago, with the dish TVs in trucks. I applaud the companies that went out and made the investment, but again, getting the right signal where you're at, depending on where you're parked at that night, it may or may not have worked. A lot of adjustments. It wasn't necessarily mobile friendly, not like it is for our homes, but it showed that the industry was listening and trying to do something. There's been technology that has worked against us a little bit, but it's not with the younger drivers. It's with our more experienced drivers. And that's
What kind of technology?
That's the driver-facing cameras. Interestingly enough, we work with companies, and some have rolled that out because of litigation expenses today and the amounts of settlements, the nuclear verdicts that have been out there. They just almost, and most started out with forward-facing, but then to protect the drivers, and it actually is a driver protection. The driver-facing camera not only saves insurance, but helps prove points. Now, if your driver's not doing the right thing, it can also not help you in that litigation. But the majority of the time, it's going to be favorable. It's going to memorialize the incident and all the details to it. How heavy was he pressing on the brake? Was he mashing the gas? What gear was he in? What was all of those things? Was it a hard brake? All those things that technology gives us now helps us become safer, but it also, younger people have grown up with technology now. And interestingly enough, it seems as though, 20-somethings, and I do have a wide range of, I've got daughters that are 27 and a son that's 49. So I've kind of had the son that didn't have the technology, and I've got the two that grew up, embedded in the technology. And my two youngest girls, 23 and 27, they have no expectation of privacy whatsoever. So cameras in their workplace, that doesn't bother them. Where they work, they have cameras everywhere. They've grown up in that environment. There's cameras in school now. And so they don't have that expectation of privacy the way that our older drivers have. So, a lot of older drivers really push back on that driver-facing cam.
Yeah, but it's a little bit different, I feel like, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here, but it feels a little bit different with a driver-facing camera, because those things are kind of right up on you, right? Like, if you get the urge to just, like, I don't know, scratch your nose or something like that,
your
that's
nose,
going to be able,
it's going to be
like, you're going to be able to
be seen.
Yeah. So,
and if that happens to be the moment you get in a car wreck or something, or
right, like, it's a little bit embarrassing.
Someone else is at fault, but you're slightly slower in your reaction time, according to a lawyer.
Yeah,
because
it just feels like yeah, it just feels like there's a little bit more pressure. Like a front facing camera feels like you're constantly in the spotlight. That's a little bit
Yes.
different than you know cameras in the
Yep.
banks.
No
To
question.
make sure
Hmm.
that feels a lot more invasive. So I can understand. I don't know that I would be able. Like I've been around technology my entire life. I don't know that I would necessarily be able to work in an environment where I feel like I'm constantly have someone in my face
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's becoming more and more common, obviously, and especially with the insurance rates because of the nuclear settlements. Insurance has been an ongoing issue every year as far as expense in the transportation industry because, it's not slowing down. And it's because of the nuclear verdicts. I mean, we see some of these verdicts that are, 30, 40, $50 million. I mean, you know, and most companies, some portion of that is self-insured, and those can be some hits. It's going to be that balancing act. And again, I see what your point is, Matt. Yeah, it's a little different than a camera in the corner of a room up on the ceiling that's looking over the room and you're working in that room with 20 other people, other than having this camera that's sitting here looking at you right in the face. And yeah, if but it's also a way to ensure that people are driving safely. Are they not driving drowsy? Are they, if you see a swerve, which your ELD will report that to the company, the incident can be viewed immediately. And if you see that driver's doing like this, you're going to call that driver and say, "Hey, pull over. You're driving drought." And that's where I think people have to see that it's not a big brother type of thing. And, as we see more success stories, because a lot of these drivers that didn't like forward facing or driver facing cameras or forward facing cameras either, many of them have the praise for them because it either saved their job or it avoided them a ticket or it avoided them responsibility for a preventable accident when it was actually non-preventable. There's always going to be the person that, is going to want to break the rules, and he's going to be driving through Tennessee and he's going to be doing like this on his cell phone. Well, all trucking companies have policies not to use a cell phone, but in Tennessee, especially because you can't even have your cell phone in your hand in Tennessee. Well,
Right.
if guys are, because there again, every one of those tickets contributes to your safety score, which then contributes to what? The cost of your insurance. So I think over time, it's just going to become like most things, what started out with many of us, especially, my generation, not liking the thought of that camera looking in our face. Once we learn and see the benefits, I think over time, it's just going to become a natural part of a job. And where it's
That's still
point all
There's still variations coming out too with that technology. Like I've seen one company in particular is pushing like an AI analysis of the video. So it would be like anonymous. There's not a person watching you at the wheel.
Yeah.
It would just
Yeah.
report like, oh, there's been like they've yawned 5 times in the last 30 minutes or
right.
that kind of stuff. So it's not as
Yes.
threatening.
Yeah, I hadn't
Depending
thought
on
of
the
that
level
thought.
of trust with the employer, of course.
Yeah.
But
I hadn't thought of that.
That's interesting.
Yeah, how does AI help streamline that privacy concern?
Yeah.
Hey, unless it detects that you may have, be in danger, no human's ever going to look at that thing.
Yeah.
And so that's another win for it. So
Yeah. Speaking of AI, what about the self-driving stuff? Like, are we in danger of like losing an entire industry in the next 10 years? Do you think?
no, if you just, think about ourselves and people that we talk to, because this has been out here now for several years. And yes, there are autonomous trucks on the road today. And some, to your point, Josh, some variation of self-driving or, testing the EVs. Many have proved to be very successful. There's been some issues. California pulled back on some regulations that had opened things up. They've kind of tightened them back because of some incidents that have occurred. But, in the next 10 years, no, we can all think about our own experiences. And I know when I'm going down the interstate and, Chris and I travel quite a bit, so we're on the interstates a lot. she'll mention it. She doesn't like it when I pass trucks on the road anyway, or when trucks pass me. They intimidate her. I mean, let's face it, guys. They're 80 foot long. They're 60 feet long, 70 feet long. They run 80,000 pounds. And you just pass the guy that's been swerving on the road, and you get up there and he's talking on his cell phone. You speed up and get past him, and she'll make the comment, and she'll say, so that's not going to have any driver in it here soon. I think from a society, we're not quite where we need to be acceptance of it to have this happen in 10 years. I don't know if it will ever happen to where we're fully autonomous, but with the electric concerns, as far as, how it affects our, I don't want to say climate, but pollution, we're from taking care of our planet, we're going to have to go mine a lot of these chemicals. And more concerning than that, because that can be done responsibly. If the country cares, it can be done responsibly, how they mine these things necessary for the batteries and things. But more importantly, how do you dispose of them? And that is my big concern, is where are all these batteries going to go? You can say, well, we're going to tear them apart and recycle, but there's a lot of chemical waste in a battery. And that's going to be a challenge. And then, as technology gets better, batteries will get lighter, etc. But right now, if you want to go with an EV truck, you're going to have to give up about 10 to 15,000 pounds of freight to be able to drive that truck, because the battery, it weighs about 10, 12,000 pounds, depending on the model and features. But, it can weigh 10 or 12,000 pounds more. Well, let's face it, folks, the weight limit's 80,000. And if your truck now, instead of weighing 20,000 pounds, weighs 32,000 pounds, that's 12,000 pounds less freight than you can haul. Typically, the dry van tractor setup for over the road typically can haul 40 to 45,000 pounds. After the tractor weight, the trailer weight, and everything, they can haul. They've got about 40 to 45,000 pounds that they can haul. Well, you take out 10 to 12,000 pounds, you just cut your load by your freight tonnage by 25%. Where's the money going to come from?
Yeah,
that's a lot, because
that
company is not going to just haul that load for 20 or 25% less. They're going to charge the same amount, which is going to drive the price of whatever that is hauling. It's going to drive it up by an equal amount. But as technology improves, the batteries will get lighter, and that problem will take care of itself at some point anyway. But
so
I don't see anything in the near future.
So the weight cap, the 80,000, that's what the roads are rated to be able to handle. Is that where you're getting that 80,000?
90% of the roads in the country that are interstate for commercial vehicles, it's 80,000. There are some exceptions. When you get up north, you get some bigger loads depending on it, but it's seasonal. They don't do it in the spring, or, during the freeze thaw, things like that. There's a lot of restrictions, but about 80,000 pounds is all our roads can. That may even be a little much. You guys have all driven on our interstates lately, We don't need heavier trucks out on those things to create more potholes.
Yeah, for sure. Do a lot of trucking companies, do most of them try to max out the weight, or is it more dependent on the type of freight? If you're
you're going to
potato chips or whatever, you still try to get
you don't
stuff in there.
It's really about filling out the cubic feet. All right. Yeah. So you don't want any leftover cubic feet. Now, unfortunately, you drag a steel coil. That could be one coil sitting in the middle of a 40-foot flatbed, and you're maxed out. All right. But if you're hauling, to your point, potato chips, just because I knew a guy that hauled a load, he went up and got a load of those My Pillows. There was a distribution center in Chicago, and he said, "Well, I can tell you what a 53-foot dry van full of pillows weigh. It weighs 7,900 pounds." So he had 30 plus thousand more pounds he could have hauled, but from a cubic foot standpoint, his trailer was full, top to ceiling, floor to wall.
Yeah.
So it's priced out at cubic feet, weight combination, depending on what the product is. But the weight is going to be a concern, because
for sure,
look at groceries. If you look at canned beans, for example, 15, 16 pallets of canned beans is all you can get on a truck. That weighs about 43,000 pounds, although they still have 4 feet above it between the top of the pallet of beans and the roof of the trailer, but they can't put anything on there because they've hit their weight limit. So, for that, it's a balancing. It's kind of a balancing act. Yeah.
Well, I think that's about where we're all the time we're gonna be able to have. We'll have to do this again because honestly, like we've got a bunch more questions. Kind of want to talk a little bit more about maybe where the industry might be headed. But we'll just have to get back together and talk about things a little bit more. I appreciate your time.
No problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.